Okay, everybody, you're very welcome to the June Book Club at the GAA Museum. I'm Julianne, and this month we've a real treat. We have not one author but two joining us, and we're going to talk about the month selection, which is All Stargazing, which I have here. A wonderful book by Moira and Eileen Dunne. So I'm so happy that you took time to, thanks so much for joining us, both of you.
Thanks,
And
Julianne.
we're going to
Lovely to be
start.
here.
It's great, and do you know what? It's great to have some female GA authors as well. So I'm delighted about that. I'm hoping there'll be more.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And the book is huge. There is so much information in it, and I've about 25,000 questions written down here. So I may stick to it or I may not. We'll see how it goes. But I suppose to start off, maybe you might both give us a little bit of background on how it came about. I know it concerned a book or a box of stuff that you found, Moira, in your attic or your dad's old belongings.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it was completely by chance, Julianne, and Dad's old office where he did a lot of his writing over the years is still kind of in situ in our house at home. And we had given a lot of his match records over to the GA Museum. They're in the archive there
Mhm.
many years ago. So it was quite well depleted, but there's still a lot of books and reference documents there. So I was looking for something one day for a player who'd actually done a favor for the family. And I was trying to find something to do with his club, and I was kind of rooting around, and I couldn't find anything. And then I came across this bashed up old box that looked like nothing. There was tape on it to keep it together, and
Wow.
I started looking through it, and what's that? I haven't been through that before. And I saw All Stars written on it, and the particular player in question had just received their first All Star. So that kind of made me dig further. Then I thought there might be something interesting of a historical nature. So I started going through it, and I just found these 25 files that covered the first 25 years of the All Stars from its inception in 1971. And each year there was a file and lots of very historical documents in relation to, I suppose, the administration of the scheme. So our father was one of the four founding journalists, and he was also the secretary of the scheme then for 25 years. So that's why he had kept all these records. And lots of fantastic things jumped out, like letters from the journalists when they were trying to get the scheme up and running to the GA, to Sean O'Sheacon, letter back from him, letters from Jack Lynch. He was the Taoiseach at the time. They invited him to the first All-Star banquet. So lots of really, really valuable documents. So I knew I'd kind of found something special, and I contacted Eileen straight away. And I remember texting her from the office saying, I found
Wow.
something amazing in Dad's office. And she was saying, wow, yeah, we'll have to do something with it. And then we knew that it was going to be 50 years in a few years' time. So we just presumed we'd hand it over to some journalist and they'd write a book or do something. And then a friend of mine actually put the idea in my head and said, why don't the two of you do something with it and take it forward? So I actually remember when she said it, I was halfway through the sentence replying, saying, sure, we could never do. And then I stopped and thought, well, why not? You know? And then we chatted about it, and then we approached the GA, and they were very excited about the idea and liked the idea of family members writing the
Yeah.
book. So it kind of went from there then. Yeah.
Wow. But I suppose a lot of people might be finding something to do with their family or, historical document and think, oh, I could do a book, but never do. So how did the idea, I suppose, come from the box to this lovely book, Eileen?
Well, I think as Myra says, it was when Marie said, why don't you two do something about it? And I remember we met out near the airport. I don't know where we were going or where we were coming from. And we started thrashing it out and, would you be interested? And, the time commitment and what could we do about it? And then when we approached the GA, and to your point about female authors, I think it appealed. It was Pádraig Duffy who signed off on it initially. And I think
Right.
that appealed to him too, the fact that it was two women that were going to write it, apart from the fact that we were mixed daughters.
Yeah.
And so once we started throwing it out there as an idea, people seemed to like the idea. So then we got more and more enthusiastic as well. And it just kind of snowballed then over the next few years.
And it's a huge, I suppose before I came to it, I didn't, I would have been aware of the All Stars and the significance, and it's such a GA Irish thing. And, it's a big big deal. But I think I thought the book was literally going to be lists of you know, winners, which, you know, obviously we need, and people love statistics. But
Yeah.
it's a total social history of Ireland, everything from the fashion in the photographs, you know, to, you know, the way things have changed, you know, the fact that the sponsors were a cigarette company, you know,
Yeah.
it's just, it shows literally the cultural changes in Ireland, you know, through sport and
Yeah.
through this. I think it's wonderful. Did you find, Moira, that as you started investigating, there was just so many areas you could go into for this?
Yeah, you've described it perfectly, Julianne, because initially I remember after that first conversation thinking, yeah, you could chronicle each year and maybe, you know, pick one player per year and do an interview with them and then have all the stats. And, you know, that was the initial idea. And then exactly that, I started going through all Dad's files and realized there was just so many angles to it and so many stories, and then the trips abroad, and you know, there was just so many elements to it that you realized, you know, there are going to be lots of themes here. And I remember
Yeah.
we met Donal Keenan, the journalist who worked very closely with us on the book, and he was one of the first people we met and consulted, and that was his reaction as well. He was saying, yeah, there's just so many angles to it, you know, it could make a very interesting book. But then that was before we went and started meeting some players. So the first few players we met, we did it chronologically. We started with the guys from the 70s, and I think then we started to realize, yeah, there are so many great stories, and you started to realize how much it meant to them at the time as well.
Yeah.
And they started getting excited as we met and started chatting, and they were remembering some, you know, some very fond memories. And that was the really strong message as well, that it was just, the scheme brings back so many happy memories to people. And they were kind of delighted to reflect and reminisce. And then also it was a side of the players that we had never really seen before, because anytime they're interviewed, it's about a match or a performance or a score or a controversy. And this was much more a human side of them, a personal side. They're talking about shopping trips in the
Yeah.
States and buying things for their wife, you know, like just a side of the players that we just hadn't seen before. So that was really exciting. And I remember sometimes we'd get back into the car after meeting someone and we'd be driving back to Dublin or driving on to the next meeting, and there'd just be an energy because we knew that we had captured something special, you know. So I think we were very excited about it as we started doing those interviews, because we could just feel the energy building around it.
Oh yes, it's lovely, and it just, I think with the older maybe recipients in particular, because they maybe came up in a different era, no social
Yeah.
media, they're probably more open in a way. I think maybe today's players are guarded, you know, and obviously sometimes like, you know, you can understand why, it's understandable. So maybe when you've retired and stepped away from it, it's easier to open up and chat. What do you think, Eileen?
Absolutely, but also the relationship with the journalists was completely different, because, you know, that opened doors. If I rang somebody, say like Liam Salmon, and said it's Eileen Dunne, it's Mick Dunne's daughter, you know, they all had such great time for those four journalists,
Yeah.
Daddy and Paddy Downey and John D. Hickey and Pádraig Purcell. And how many times was it said, oh, you were in our house with your father all those years ago, you know, and people making scones and apple tarts and things like that. That just doesn't happen anymore. I mean, we would remember Dad going off the week before the All-Ireland or the semi-finals, going to the separate counties and interviewing numerous players. And I suppose
Yeah.
the one thing that annoys me at the moment, you see in the run-up to a big match, one player from each team is sent out. So the same interview is turning up in every newspaper and on every channel. It was just so different. And then come forward, and the younger players would say to us that actually the trips, and we wondered, you know, what the dynamic would be and how they would view the whole thing. But one of the things was that it gave them the chance to get to know some of the journalists, that they just didn't know them in the same way. So Sean Kavanagh, for example, with Damien Lawler, who ended up working on his book with him.
It's interesting. I saw Eugene McGee in the book says, you know, he played handball with your dad, so they obviously socialized together, and it was a much different time. So yeah, and I see even the long, I suppose, player interviews and profiles are gone in the newspapers now. So this is maybe bringing us back to, you know, a different era. And the story then at the start, it's nearly a book on its own, how these friends and journalists and GAA fans started it. Like, it's a great, you could nearly make, you know, a series of TV. It's amazing. You know, I wonder, would they have thought it would still be going? Like, what do you think, Moira, looking, I suppose, between the idea behind it and what it became?
Yeah, I mean, it is lovely. And I suppose that original sentiment that the four journalists wanted to set up this scheme so that they could thank the players for the pleasure they had given them all year. I mean, even that sentiment is lovely, and again shows the respect that was there, and how much time they had for each other. So yeah, I mean, I think because it took them so long to get it up and going, they tried it for many years and they had a few false starts, but persisted with it. It is lovely to think that we're here 50 years, even more now at this stage later, and it's going strong, which is just fantastic. It's such a tribute to them, and I think that's what makes it so special as well. You know, to know that their efforts came to fruition. But the other thing that I suppose what that is important to us, and we were delighted that it came through in the book, it was a chance to establish that it was four journalists who started the scheme, that it was a journalist scheme, and I think that's important to the journalists today, that is recorded, and that they're continuing that legacy now as well.
It's funny, and I had never really thought about how it started. You know, it just was like, it's been there, and it's a core part of, you know, the GAA season. It's kind of the end every year, and you're coming into Christmas and all of that. So yeah, it was a very interesting story. So Eileen, physically, to do this book, you did a lot of actual physical work. You went around the country and met all of these people. And I know Moira was telling me it was pre-COVID mostly, so you were lucky in that you could still travel. So how did you go about it, and how did you plan what you would do?
Well, I suppose we were lucky, as Moira, excuse me, as Moira said, that we were ahead of the posse. And as she said, we started with the first teams, the 1971 hurling and football all-stars, and we interviewed as many of those as we could. When it came to later teams, we just picked maybe a couple from each county or whatever, because I mean, there are more than 800 all-stars. We couldn't get to them all. And we also wanted to talk to other stakeholders like the sponsors, even the sculptors who designed the trophies. You know, we wanted to bring in as many strands as we could, but obviously primarily it was hurlers and footballers we wanted to talk to. So as I say, we started with the first teams, and I would try and get an email. I'd introduce myself, introduce the concept. We'll get a phone number first and say, then, have you got an email address? And, you know, I'll outline in more detail. And I mean, the reaction was, you know, just overwhelming. People were delighted, and then particularly those older guys, they'd say, oh, I don't know, sure, I can't remember, it's 50 years ago and all the rest of it. But then they would go away and think about it, and maybe turn up with jerseys and flags and mementos, and they would have been thinking about it then for a few days and come out with lots of stories, you know. And even more so if we met a few together. We had a wonderful session in Kilkenny with Frank Cummins and Eddie Kerr and Noel Skehan, and the crack was mighty. And then we were going on that day to meet Eamon Cregan and Pat Hartigan in Limerick, and they were sending messages across to the two boys in Limerick. So it was all, so we would get one story maybe in Kilkenny and then go and hear another angle to it in Limerick. So it was kind of one thing borrowing another. And of course, these were all our heroes too growing up, so we were loving every minute of it.
It's exciting seeing them coming together. We were the same if they come into the museum. And I love the idea of the objects, because that's, I suppose, what we were about in the museum, to like inspire in a memory. So a jersey, and I know you have a lot of the images of the objects in the book. Like, I love the menu. I think that's a really Irish thing, to keep a menu from you know, a wedding or something. How did you photograph as you went, or where did you get all of the images, Moira?
Yeah, it was a real mixture. So a lot of the images were in Dad's files as well, because he kept a scrapbook every year of the trips, you know, so there was a lot of memorabilia there, some very original photographs that had never been seen before. And then, as Eileen said, a lot of the players did bring their own memorabilia as well. So yeah, we used to photograph them going around, or then somebody would send us through something. Like, I remember John Quigley in Wexford, we'd met him and his brother Martin, and then a few months later he sent a document through by email that he'd come across since, you know, so that happened a good bit. So yeah, we just gathered bits as we went, and it was you know you'd be so delighted when you discover another document, you know. So that was really fantastic. And then, of course, as we kept going, we were filling in more of the, you know, it was like a jigsaw piecing together what happened because it wasn't recorded anywhere. And then so we'd have a lot of prompts then as we met players later on because we'd say, do you remember that trip? And they'd, you know, that'd prompt their memory. And then what was most amusing was where you got a completely different side of the same incident from two different camps. Most notably, the Dublin Kerry incident. There was a charity match in the 70s played out in New York. I won't go into all the details, but it's all in the book. That's my favourite story because we got one angle from the Kerry players and completely different view from the Dublin players. That was just hilarious, you know. Yeah.
And they stick by their stories completely on both sides.
Absolutely. Yeah. Still convinced. Yeah.
I love those stories are great, and I love the I suppose the personal stories about the friendships, you know, on the tours and the romance. And I wasn't really expecting that when you think of the All Stars. I'm sure that was obviously a huge part of it. There's weddings and proposals, and and I wonder. I know, Moira, when we met originally, you were saying maybe it was because it was two women that were interviewing. Maybe those stories came out a little bit more.
Possibly, yeah. People felt more inclined to tell us. I mean, and again, the different angles, because Pat Spillane would say how many Colleens and Aarons were wheeled out at every function, all these Irishmen trying to marry off their daughters. But then you come to Robbie Gallagher's wife, and her father managed to marry off two of them because her sister married a hurler. So it worked for them. So yeah, all those kind of stories that just liven it up and again give the sort of social history aspect to it. I mean, when those players went to San Francisco in the early 1970s, some of them may have been to the East Coast, but they certainly hadn't been to the West Coast, most of them. And they're walking around, you know, in hippie land in San Francisco. You can just imagine what it was like for them just to land young, innocent Irish men just off the plane, you know.
Yeah, and the photos are great. They really capture it, you know. You could definitely see it on TV or something. I just thought it was brilliant. The banquet then, I suppose, and there's a few themes. The banquet's a huge deal. I loved the early one when they didn't give them any boots and they're in the photos at the start. Like, there's very funny stories and very uniquely Irish things, I think, that people will remember. So anyone who hasn't, you know, got the book, I think it works obviously to talk about, but to see the images, I think, is amazing. When you had everything collated, Moira, how did you go about planning it and chapters? Like, it's a huge thing, even what to include from your dad's correspondence. I know a lot of the letters are in. But I suppose a part of editing and being good at it is knowing what not to put in as well. So did that process take a long time?
I suppose it did. Yeah, it's like you know, when you look back, it doesn't seem long now because you're through it and you're over it. But I suppose at the time it did. But it was very much a passion project. You know, I enjoyed every minute of it and every hour that I spent working on it because again, I think there was just that excitement and energy after we'd done all the interviews. You kind of knew we had really good materials to work with, and I started kind of pulling it together and writing it as we were doing the interviews. So you were beginning to try to get the shape of it, you know, and sometimes you might do an interview and thinking, I know where that's going to go, you know, what chapter, etc. So it started to come together. It was very much the themes, I suppose. And then, we obviously there was the narrative part of it, and then the stats. We decided, well, we'd put all the lists of stats and everything kind of at the back of the book, so it's there as a reference piece. But you know, the main thrust of the book are the stories and the interviews, really, because that's the bit that people are most interested in. So yeah, it came together really. The stats. Definitely being in lockdown helped, checking all those nominees, because we've got the names of all the players who've ever been nominated. So that was like 4,500 names. So it definitely helped having some weekends in lockdown to just put your head down and go through that. Yeah.
And then as we came into, I suppose, the book coming out and everything, we were in the middle of COVID then, Eileen. did that kind of change your plans in any way?
Oh, it did, of course, because we were supposed to come out in 2020, which would have been the 50th All-Stars.
Yeah.
And we were a year late, but we were on the 50th anniversary, if you like, because the first All-Stars were in 1971. But just to the nominees, there's one lovely story, the Loans, Brian and Frank. Brian has 4 All-Stars and Frank has 1. Their father was nominated in the 70s and they didn't realise that. So that was one of those nice moments when we were down with them. And we met Frank in a hotel and then we ended up going up to the house to the parents. And Brian came and joined us there. So it's, you know, we ended up on a potato farm. We ended up in a garage. We ended up in the men's shed in Tullamore. You never knew where this journey was going to bring you.
Yeah.
Wow, I loved there's a couple of lovely little small lines in it that maybe just, I suppose, highlight the importance. There's one, I think, when Gooch is talking about, you know, being really shy. You never think of that, you know, because it's like nearly, as you say, in at the Oscars for GAA players, and he was 19 on his first, you know, nomination, and he's coming up, and he had only worn a suit for his debs before. Like, you never think of that. This is a huge deal for these players, and they may be, you know, like full of confidence on the pitch, but this is a totally different scene. So it definitely made me think about the, you know, the whole process in a different way. And I liked, you know, the acknowledgement. People said it was a kind of way of, you know, paying back the family and friends for sticking with them. And Sean O talked about his wife, you know, getting excited to come up for the trip. So yeah, I think it's lovely to have all of this. Is there anything else you feel like you could do with the material? It feels to me like there's so much, you know, you could go back and do TV or podcast, or have you any plans like that, Moira?
Not at the moment, no. I suppose we were just so delighted to get it done and out there.
Yeah.
For now, we're taking a breather, but yeah, you're right. There is just so much material. Obviously, it'd be lovely if some of it goes into the museum as well. We've talked about that. You know, it'd be nice for it to be accessible, that people can see it. You know, rather than it sitting in an office where nobody can see it. So we'd certainly love it to have it on display somewhere. There was a documentary at Christmas time that was on, so there was a good bit of coverage in that as well. So that's recorded. So, but yeah, who knows? Yeah, maybe there are podcast opportunities down the road. Who knows? Yeah.
Yeah, I even think, as I said, a series about the founders, because it's so interesting. Like, what a unique idea at the time. Because we're used to kind of those kind of recognitions now, but at the time it was very forward thinking. What do you think your dad would think of the book, Eileen, or is that a hard question to answer?
No, yeah, but I hope he'd be proud. But I mean, a couple of things on that. The atmosphere was changing within the GAA. We'd had the McNamee Commission, and they were beginning to allow sponsorship. And I think Sean O'Sheacon, you know, new television was coming too, and things had to change. And so they were open to the idea, and nobody was going to move. Carol's too were well positioned. They were sponsoring golf and tennis at the time, but they could see that the GAA, being involved with the GAA, would have a much bigger impact. So it was, you know, a combination of factors. One of the things that we found was an article that Daddy wrote for an annual. So it was a couple of months after the first trip, and he's reflecting on the journey that the 4 guys had come on to get it to that point. So we used that article as the first chapter in the book. And so that brings Dad into it, if you like.
Yes.
So I hope he'd be proud of it. I think he would be. I mean, you'd like to think that if he was still alive, he might have done it himself for the 50th anniversary, but I'm delighted. For him.
Oh, it's a legacy to him to have it there. And that article, I meant to mention that, actually, is lovely. And the style's lovely. There's funny little kind of jokes, throwaway jokes, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great.
And our mum is still with us, Julianne. So she really enjoyed the whole journey that we went through, because we'd be coming back with the stories, and she knew some of the players, you know, so she had her own memories to chip in, because she had gone on many tours as well. So for her, it was a very, very proud moment when the book came out. We did have, as we mentioned there earlier, our plans for the launch were curtailed, but we were still very lucky to have a launch at all. It was last November. We had 60 people in Croke Park in the Players' Lounge. So it was a very special night, and she was able to be there along with our other sister Una. So for the family, that was very special. And we felt that had kind of just brought the whole thing full circle, really, for Dad.
Oh, absolutely. It's a brilliant book, and definitely one we'll have in the museum, and hopefully, as you say, we can do something with it. You know, there's so much there, and as you say, it would be lovely for people to see these documents and objects, and the photos I think are brilliant as well. I suppose my last question then to both of you is, what is your favorite story from the book? If you want to go first. Yeah.
I already mentioned it's the Dublin Kerry charity match in in New York. So that just ended up being a mass brawl between the two teams. It was a horribly wet day, seemingly. The match shouldn't have been played at all. It was for a charity for, as Pat Spillane said, the Home for the Bewildered. And the two teams were like bewildered people on the pitch. It was at the height of the Dublin-Kerry rivalry. Kerry hadn't gotten the upper hand yet. Dublin had beaten them a few times, and they Kerry say they had decided they were going to go out and put down a marker that day in that charity match. And I think they end up winning, although I don't know if anybody remembers, so many players were sent off. There was broken noses, there was all sorts. And then they went on and subsequently had a very big win against Dublin back in the championship following that. So they reckon that was the turning point. The Dubs say that's just nonsense. We were just an aging team, you know, it was going to happen anyway. It was nothing to do with that match. So as I say, that was very amusing. There's some really funny quotes in it. So for anyone who hasn't gotten the book and does get it, look that one up. I think it's 1978 the match happened. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Mine concerns John Connolly, the Galway hurler, who was on the very first team. And the big thing then was the posters. If people remember the posters, particularly during Bank of Ireland sponsorship, the posters were up in banks all over the country. But for the Carol's posters, so these photographers were landing once guys were nominated, but sure, half the time they didn't even know they were nominated. And then the photographer would come and, does this mean I'm getting an award? But the photographer obviously wasn't at liberty to say, no, I'm photographing everyone. But John Connolly came home one day and his mother told him the photographer was here looking for you. He wants to take a photograph for the poster and he's coming back tomorrow. But John had been playing in an inter-company championship the previous weekend and he got a black eye. So he says, if you look at my photograph, it's side on. I'm doing my best Porrick Pierce impression to hide the black eye.
Wow. And funny, Humphrey Kelleher, who did our last book club, he was involved with the Bank of Ireland, so he had some memories when we were chatting after his book, you know, about I think his job was to take the nominations, you know, and so he was actually the first person sometimes who would know, you know, who the winners were, and he had some funny stories about trying to organise the photographer and that sort of thing.
That's right, because it moved on, so they used to do them then the morning after the banquet. The poster was produced after the banquet rather than ahead of it. So Humphrey would be delegated to try and get them out of the bed and have them looking half sensible for the photograph.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, it's brilliant that all of this is captured now in a book. So anyone who hasn't had a chance yet, please do read it. If you love the GAA, and I suppose even, as I say, social history of Ireland, it is an incredible one to have at home, and it's one you can pick up and pass around, and it definitely would inspire conversations. I know my own dad would love it, and you know, particularly some of the players he would admire. You mentioned the Lohans and the Connollys, who he would love. So yeah, thank you for that. I really enjoyed it. Hopefully we can do something else, as you say, in the museum around the book, but everyone watch this space, and we'll be announcing some children's summer reading, I guess, over the next few days as well for our book club for July and August. So thank you both very much. I really enjoyed that. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Julianne.
Thanks, Julianne.